every Sunday night, just about, I mentioned that we're grateful to see everyone. I hope that doesn't get old to you. But I am grateful. I'm thankful for health and strength, opportunities to be out and about and go about business. I don't feel that old, but there are a lot of people just my age who can't get around or are dead. And I'm thankful that I'm still among you and we're together. We've been going through a loose type of formatting of 1 Corinthians, actually. I told myself earlier I'm not going to even mention that this is a series. So I'm not mentioning that this is a series, but you can take that for what it means. But we've been talking about the Corinthian letter, and we've been talking about some subjects that have come out of the Corinthian letter. Want to remember that Paul was at Ephesus when he wrote the Corinthians, and he'd been there in the second journey, and there were all kinds of problems that Paul faced when he went there, and yet the Lord said to Paul in a vision in the night that I have much people in this city, and they were able to overcome difficulties. The general population was enamored with oratory, worldly wisdom. There was dishonest business dealings in the agora or the marketplace, and immorality associated with the various idol gods and idol temples that were in the city, on the Acropolis particularly. All kinds of drunkenness, banqueting, and the revelry that would go along with immorality and paganism and drunkenness. And so when Paul was at Ephesus, after a while there came to him a visit from some in the household of Chloe, and they reported some conditions to Paul that were not good. And the first six chapters deal with some of those corrections of problems. Division, primarily over preachers, over wisdom. There was immaturity among them. There was immorality, chapter 5. And they ought to have been judging things among themselves, and yet they were taking those things to civil court. So Paul dealt with that in chapter 6. And then he came back to why fornication was wrong in the end of chapter 6. And then chapter 7 through really the end is a second part of the letter that evidently they'd written him questions. And he said, concerning the things whereof you wrote. And a lot of things we've talked about in these matters. Chapter 7, last week we spoke concerning questions that would have arisen relative to marriage. Tonight, I want us to talk really about 3 chapters, overview 3 chapters. And if you have your New Testaments and you open your New Testaments to 1 Corinthians, the 8th chapter, the very first verse of chapter 8 gives the subject matter of the next 3 chapters, really down to chapter 11, verse 1. Now, concerning things sacrificed to idols, concerning that. And he really goes on until 11, verse 2. When he says, now I praise you that you remember me in all things. There's another subject that comes up. So we want to talk about this. We've been talking about the subjects that we have here on the chart behind me. One thing I was thinking, and I've mentioned this in our lessons before, that I'm trying to accomplish, more than just one idea. One thing is that we pointed this out a couple of lessons ago, that in the minds of many, Jesus is like on one side of the ledger and the epistles are on another side. And it's almost as if never the twain would meet. That Jesus has his life and he's all about love and all this, and these epistles were just taking care of practical issues and have no relevance for us today. But that denies really the inspiration of the whole of the New Testament. The apostles spoke and stated in their speaking and their writings that what they were saying was not of themselves, but it was from God. It was inspired of God. And they received it through the Holy Spirit. So the point we're making is that here, while we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we have the life of Jesus. Jesus told them that he would go away, the Spirit would come, and he would guide them into all the truth, the finality, the extension of what he said. He said on one occasion in John 16, I have many things to say unto you, but you can't bear them now. They weren't ready. Howbeit, when he, the Spirit of truth, is come, he will guide you into all the truth. So the Spirit would basically take up where Jesus left off when he ascended into heaven. So tonight, what we want to do is talk about, as we mentioned last week, marriage questions that Paul had answered. And tonight I want us to talk about this question of influence and another's conscience. That's about as good as I can do in summarizing the overall theme, it seems to be, 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. We pointed out, again, in a former lesson, how we have Jesus' life and his teachings, and we see the applications in letters, as we noticed. But I wanted to emphasize this that we have here highlighted. Influence is always to be good, said Jesus. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But you're the salt of the earth. If the salt have lost its savor, it's thenceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and trodden under the foot of men. You're the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a stand, so that it gives light to all that are in the house. And then the kicker. He springs the trap door, if you please, and says, even so let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. That's the purpose. The purpose of living a good life is not only a right life, righteous life, is not only for heaven ourselves and avoid hell, but it's to try to influence and encourage others to do the same. And I believe that we can see all of this illustrated so extremely well in 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10. I want us to spend just a moment or two about the idea of influence. Jesus' life and teaching on influence. We quoted that passage in Matthew 5, 13 through 16. But you will remember, I'm certain, that the verses that precede that are commonly known as the Beatitudes because of the Latin word beatus, which means blessed, and that's how each of these starts. It's interesting that in the Beatitudes, Jesus turns the table, and what seems to be not the truth is ironically the truth. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, those who understand I need God so desperately. I'm impoverished spiritually without Him. That's the kind of person to which the kingdom of heaven belongs. You're the kind of person God's looking for. Blessed are those that mourn. They're sorry, not glad about their sins. They don't parade them around and as a show off or a thing like a trophy. No, I'm saddened that I ever lived that kind of a lifestyle. And the meek who are docile and they understand that, it's not because I'm so strong, but I need to be bendable to the will of God, and hungering and thirsting after righteousness, and merciful because I know I've had mercy extended to me, so I need to be compassionate or merciful toward others. I need to be genuine, pure in heart, recognizing they will see God, and recognizing that peace has been extended to me by God through Christ, and I can have peace with them. Then I want others to have the same kind of peace that I enjoy. I want them to be at peace with God. And when two people are both at peace with God, they're going to be at peace with each other. That's just an inevitable consequence. And those that have been persecuted for righteousness' sake, they're willing to take it on the chin because of following the Lord and doing what's right. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. For my sake. Not just do it because they don't like the way your hair's combed or you're wearing something that's gaudy, but because you're doing right and they're persecuting you for doing right. Blessed are you. You're favored by God. To them belong the kingdom of heaven. So it's at this juncture that Jesus says, but you're the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Right after the Beatitude, blessed are you when people persecute you. The Beatitudes delineate the character of kingdom citizens, and though we become different from and considered odd by the world, kingdom citizens really are the world's only hope. The ones who are actually persecuting us because of righteousness, we're their only hope. We're to be light and salt even to people who would persecute us. And though set apart from the world, Christians are related to the world in a special way. We are salt and light. We preserve, which I think is the main meaning behind the salt, and light, we give order. We show what a proper perspective in areas that are dark. Salt preserves. It purifies. We know from meats that salt preserves them, and I think that's the primary use of it in the Bible, both Testaments. Jesus' use involves how Christians are to preserve the world from corruption, from decay, and from death, and making it more palatable, which often is stated, may be a secondary application. And I know it's true when we, for instance, let your speech be with grace, seasoned with salt, Colossians 4, verse 6. Well, when people speak with grace, seasoned with salt, things do go better. I know that's certainly a byproduct of all this. Not certain it's the primary one the Lord had in mind. If you think about it, in the Old Testament, there was not enough salt among the antediluvian world to save it from the flood. There was not enough salt in Sodom to save it. Not enough salt in Israel among the men who were 20 years of age and older who were held accountable before God. That generation died out. Not enough salt in all of them. And then light. The light of the world. Light drives out darkness. And throughout the Scripture, it symbolizes God's presence, purity, oftentimes truth, as contrasted to darkness and the absence of God, impurity, sin, ignorance. For 1 John 1 verse 5 says, God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. And if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Christ cleanses us from all sins. But if any man say he has no sin, he lies and does not the truth. So here light is in contrast to darkness and sin. And walking in the light is walking in the essence of the gospel. In chapter 2 of 1 John, he says, if a man say he loves his brother, say he loves God but hates his brother, he's in darkness. He's not in light. So you have light as pictured of God, things that are right and good, that give view of how things really are, the proper perspective on things. And Paul said in Ephesians, the 5th chapter, that we are not to have any fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. Just a verse or two earlier, he said, you're children of light, and walk therefore as such. So all of those passages indicate the contrast between the darkness of the world, the light of the gospel, the truth of the gospel, the purity of the gospel, and what we are to be. Now, influence is not in older translations. I found in a search that it's only in a couple of times in the newer ones, it's 2 or 3 times. But the idea of influence is basically on every page of the Bible. Every page. The idea of influence. It is defined as the power or capacity of causing an effect in indirect or intangible ways. Merriam-Webster says the word sway is a synonym. It's the act or power of producing an effect without apparent exertion of force or direct exercise or command. Not holding a gun in front of somebody but this, the power of influence. Sometimes I'll use the phrase, the power and influence of the gospel. I think that's a part of what's meant in Romans 1:16. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God unto salvation. The story of the gospel, the story of Jesus, the story of what he's done, the story of his resurrection, the guidance, all of that rolled together has power. It's powerful. These events themselves are powerful. And that power influences you and me if we believe it strongly enough. And so the act or power of producing, now does God make us? He doesn't make us. He doesn't force us to follow his will. We do that through the influence and the power of the gospel. You might want to think the word inflow or influx. There's interesting, if you look at some of the more exhaustive definitions of influence it has a varied meaning. But anyway, the inflow, something coming into you, all of that. I'd like to just pause for a moment and to think with you about the idea of influence. So a lot of us never think about it, or I think some of us don't think about it as much as we can. I dare say if I ask some of you fellows who are still working out, what influenced you to do what you did for your life's income? If you went back, there would be someone or some idea that you got from some person that turned your thinking in a particular direction. So far as people to date, people to marry, there have been influence. Brother Bob Waldron used to tell the story about when Leon was in Blackshear and he had been dating Sister Linda for a while, and they were kind of slow, and Bob said, "You just need to go ahead and marry her." Well, he did. There was an influence there. You need to go ahead and do that. He told me basically the same thing with Lee. You just need to go ahead and not ask any more questions. You've been with her long enough. Just go ahead and marry. Yeah, I think you're right. I think I will. We're influenced in dating and influence in our marriage, influence in schools, where to go, sometimes what to study in schools. We're influenced in how we speak. I don't know how many times I've seen you. I'm sure you're the same way. You see a young fellow and then you all of a sudden you notice a particular speech nuance, or perhaps a mannerism in the speech, maybe a voice inflection that sounds exactly like a mother or a dad, or perhaps a grandmother or granddad who had been influential in his life. Our mannerisms sometimes can be copied. I don't know if you all watch college football, some of the things the players do when they score a touchdown or they get a first down, and then before you know it, everybody else is doing the same thing. And some of us who are a little bit older wonder, well, what is that supposed to mean? The mannerisms. I remember years ago, somebody told me Brother Bill Hall was holding a meeting, and he had at least at that time, he had a kind of a mannerism that he, like a lot of us, he just crossed his legs when he was sitting on the front pew. Well, in time during the week, there was a little fella, and he was sitting with his mama, and he was just squirming. He just couldn't do, and she was, "What is wrong with you?" He said, "I can't cross my legs like Brother Hall." He was trying, Brother Hall's, yeah, well, I want to be like that. And you know, this was brought home to me years ago when I was living it was before Lee and I married, and I was out running, and I had some sweatpants on that were kind of beige. I remember it like it's yesterday. Not dark, but kind of beige looking. And a little fella that I was fairly close to his family, his grandmother was taking him, and they were wanting to buy some clothes and play clothes and whatnot. And he just kept saying, that's not what I want. That's not what I want. Well, what's wrong with it? Well, that's not what Brother Philip wears. And he said, you don't even know the kind of influence that you have among little people along those lines. What you wear. You know, if a person has on an Alabama jersey, and he may be 50 or 60 years old, or maybe 10 years old, and he has a number 2 on it, or has a number 15 on, well, you know, well, he thinks that this fellow who plays ball, he holds the limelight in his thinking. All of those things mean things. They are influential. Somebody drink Bud Light. You know exactly what they do. You don't have to question about that. And so how we present ourselves has an influence on people. All of us do. Years ago, I remember hearing Charles Barkley, and I like to hear Charles Barkley speak on basketball and some other things. The round mound of rebound. But he made a comment because he'd gotten into some trouble with the law at one point. He said, "I am no role model." And I think, Charles, you're wrong about that. A lot of young people look up to you. And whether you want to be or not, you are. And everything you do and say has an impact on other people. They listen to you. And so it has to be. So all of us have that. And Jesus says that our influence ought to be good. There's one other passage before we actually look at 1 Corinthians 8, or overview it at least. In the 18th chapter of Matthew, Jesus had a lot to say about our influence, though the word's not even mentioned. In Matthew 18 and also in Mark, the 9th chapter, which is a parallel of this, Jesus has come to Capernaum. And the apostles have been arguing among themselves, as Mark, the 9th chapter shows, who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So in Matthew, the 18th chapter, they say that. Who then is the greatest in the kingdom? Verse 1. And he called to him a little child and set him in the midst of them and said, except you turn or be converted and become as little children, ye shall in no wise enter the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoso shall receive one such little child in my name receives me. But whoso shall cause one of these little ones that believe on me to stumble, it is profitable for him that a great millstone should be hanged about his neck and that he should be sunk in the depth of the sea. That is a very, very haunting idea. To have a millstone, if you can imagine, just a huge rock that's been honed out and it's tied around your neck and you're thrown off a boat into the middle of the sea, and all of a sudden you start going down and you feel the water pressure on your ear, and then you look up and it's getting darker and darker, and you know you can't breathe or you'll drown. It's a haunting idea if you think about it. And he says it's better for that to happen than for you to cause one of these little ones that believe on me to stumble. It's better in the sense that this is worse. This is worse to do that. It's better for you to have that done, and that's terrible. This is even worse than that. In Mark, the 9th chapter, turn over to Mark 9, just briefly. This is the parallel, and it gives some background. In Mark 9, in verse 33, Mark 9:33, they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, they asked him, or he asked them, what were you reasoning in the way? But they held their peace, for they had disputed one another who was to be greatest. And he sat down and called the 12 and said, if any man would be first, he shall be last and servant of all. And then he took a little child and set him in the midst. Whosoever shall receive one such little children, or one of such little children in my name, receives me. And whosoever receives me receives not me, but him that sent me. And then John said, Teacher, we saw one casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him, because he followed not us. And Jesus said, Forbid him not, for there is no man who shall do a mighty work in my name, and be able quickly to speak evil of me. For he that is not against us is for us. And goes on from there. Here is John, an apostle. And here we don't know anything about this disciple, except Jesus entrusted him with the power to cast out demons. He, based on the context, he was obviously on the Lord's side. But John wanted him not to have these powers, kind of exclude him, put him out. That is the background from what is stated in the rest of Mark 9, as well as Matthew 18. We're trying to exclude or put away certain ones, and who's going to be number one, and big I and little you. All of those things were a part of that, and perhaps a tone of jealousy on the part of John. The apostles had argued over who among themselves should be the greatest. That was causing people to stumble or to sin. And there was some jealousy, evidently, on John's part, a desire to exclude another disciple to whom Jesus had given miraculous powers. Brother McGarvey makes this comment in his comments on Mark. Such jealousy in regard to official prerogatives is a very common passion, and one against which men occupying positions of trust and authority should be constantly on their guard. Jealousy for official prerogatives. I think I've seen that in the church. Here's a man who's here maybe as an eldership in place with 2 or 3 men. And here's another man who is equally qualified, and it's like we don't need you. We're fine the way we are. And that ought never to be. People ought to be, there ought to be an application to the fullest extent possible of anyone who is qualified for any kind of official work in the church. And that leads to Jesus' longer explanation and the warning against doing something that would lead a person to his own stumbling, his own sin, and causing another to stumble. And that's the rest of chapter 18. 18 deals with this idea of causing others to offend, causing yourself to offend. And then it ends with, well, what about if a fellow has offended or caused you or has sinned against you and he repents? What about that? What about doing it 7 times? You remember that. And then Jesus gives the long parable about that. So that's what Matthew 18 is about. It's about this same idea of being careful about our influence. Whatever we do, we want to lead people to Christ, not repel them from him. We want to help, not hinder, not harm in everything we do. Essentially, be very careful about our influence, and that obviously involves the thinking of others and their consciences. That is diametrically opposed to our world. Our world is all about, I'll do what I want to do. If I have the right to do it, I'll do it, regardless of how it affects you. That is our world. And all of this is opposed to that thinking, that I should be interested in what is in your best interest. I should be doing and saying what can help you go to heaven. Now, this was Jesus during his life's ministry. Now, when we put all that together and try to summarize, salt is to be good, to preserve others from spiritual destruction and to purify. That's it in a nutshell. And to show the right way in the midst of darkness, purity and life. Matthew 18 shows the terribleness of causing another or influencing any other person to sin. Other passages that relate to it, Matthew 20:28, the Son of Man came not to be ministered to, but to serve, to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. And in 1 Peter 2, hereunto were you called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example to follow his steps. So just as Jesus gave an example, our example is to follow his in trying to help people be saved and to have an influence for good. Now, we seek others' salvation and provide a good example. Now, I want us to go back to 1 Corinthians here. The 8th through 10th chapters condemn the failure and the unconcern over causing others to stumble. He mentions in chapter 8, verse 1, now concerning things sacrificed to idols. That meant the portion of an animal of flesh that was left over after sacrifices. Some say even as little as a whisker of a cow might be offered to the idol god. And then the leftover part, which was a primary part of the animal, was either eaten sacrificially or taken home for private meals or sold in the marketplace. Basically 3 things. And there were 3 questions that were involved, and Paul discusses them. And evidently what was going on is the Corinthians were saying it's all right on all that. You do whatever you want with meat, do whatever you want with it, wherever you want to do it, it just doesn't matter. Yet some had come out of idolatry and had difficulty disassociating the meat offered to an idol from the worship and the communion with the idol god. Well, they thought, well, here's an animal, and it's been offered in this idol. If I eat that, it's almost like I'm having communion with the God. And I'm believing in the God. I believe the God has provided various things. And then when I eat that meat, I'm having fellowship with him. Similarly, with the Lord's Supper. We'll come to that in just a moment. Well, what were they to do? I've used this chart in some classes before, and trying to make it just clear cut. That the 3 parts to the thing sacrificed to idols, a small part was offered to an idol god, could be a whisker, could be a tail, a small part. Then a part for the priest and other temple officials. And then the remaining part of the animal, which was, from what I've understood reading outside the Bible, could have been a large part, even larger than any of the other. And you could do with it maybe one of 3 things. You could use it in a meal, either in or close to a pagan temple. You could do that, or in the temple itself. You could carry it home, or you could offer it for sale in a local market. Well, Paul answers those, the 3 questions. Can a Christian eat meat in an idol's temple? The answer on that is very firm in chapter 8, and that is no. Because somebody can see you in this idol's temple, and they don't know. They don't know that meat is meat, and it will not commend you to God. They don't know that. Look in chapter 8, 1 Corinthians 8, and we'll just mention that in those earlier verses he says that, a lot of us have knowledge that meat will not commend us to God. We're not better if we eat or worse if we don't eat. But he says in verse 7, there is not in all men that knowledge. Some being used until now to the idol, eat as of a thing sacrificed to an idol, their conscience being weak is defiled. But you notice down in verse 10, for if a man see thee who has knowledge sitting at meat in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be emboldened to eat things sacrificed to idols? For through thy knowledge, he that is weak perishes, the brother for whose sake Christ died. And thus sinning against the brethren, wounding their conscience when it is weak, ye sin against Christ. Wherefore, if meat causes my brother to stumble, I will eat no flesh forevermore, that I cause not my brother to stumble. So the point is, in an idol's temple, and here you have, the meat's been offered, and here's a brother who comes in and he says, I know meat is meat. There's nothing behind this idol. There's no gods but one. He mentions that in verse 6. To us, there's one God, the Father, one Lord Jesus Christ. We all know that. And so I'm just going to go ahead. But here's a fellow who's become a Christian, and he sees you right there. And he's thinking, when I used to do this, I was offering my adoration to whoever it was, Apollo, or Aphrodite, or whoever it was. I'm offering my praise to that God by eating a portion of this meat. If it's all right for him to do, it's all right for me to do, and go back to that. So Paul says, don't do that. Don't cause a person to go back into sin. Number 2, can a Christian eat meat in the home of an unbeliever? Chapter 10 answers that. Yes, he can, but there is a catch. If the fellow says, hey now, this has been offered in sacrifice to an idol, then you just put your plate from you. Stop. Don't do it. Don't do that. Don't it. But not for your own conscience, but the conscience of the one in whose house you're eating. Because he thinks by your eating that you think it's all right to do all these things. Can a Christian eat meat sold in a pagan city market? Yes. Just don't ask any questions. He answers that question in that last paragraph. Chapter 10, verses 25. You can do that. But in the occasions where you know that there is the thought process on the parts of others, that they think you're condoning what they used to do, he says, do not do that anymore. So, chapter 8, while meat is only meat, it carries more meaning to some, verses 3 through 9. The specific application, if they see you in an idol's temple, their consciences will be emboldened to do what they know is wrong. The principle and the warning from all this is powerful, my friends. In verses 12 and 13, thus sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it's weak, you sin against Christ. It's not just, it kind of hurt his feelings over there, or maybe he'll get over it. You're sinning against Christ. And then the last verse, wherefore if meat causes my brother to stumble, I'll eat no flesh forevermore, that I cause not my brother to stumble. I don't want to do a thing in the world that will cause a person to be lost or to be weak. Does that not parallel everything we were talking about? Sure it does. These are specific applications of that. Well, now, to give an illustration of what he meant, in chapter 9, we most of us know chapter 9 is about the fact that it's justifiable to support preachers. But contextually, what Paul was talking about, he says, I've got a right to be married. Barnabas and I, do we have to keep working? Well, the answer is no, we don't. We have a right. He says in verse 12, he says, nevertheless, we did not use, verse 12, if others partake of this right over you, did we not yet more? Nevertheless, we did not use this right, but we bear all things that we may cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Verse 15, but I've used none of these things, and I write not these things that it may be so done in my case, for it were good for me rather to die than that any man should make my glorying virtue. He had a right to be supported. But evidently there were those in Corinth, as he alluded to in the first part of the chapter, that were saying, well, Paul's just doing this for money. And so he said, I'm not going to take any of your money. And that'll show I'm not doing this for money. In fact, in the second letter, he said, I robbed other churches, taking wages of them that I might not burden you. But so Paul, let's put it back, in chapter 9 is sandwiched between chapter 8 and chapter 10 by his saying there could be some things that are okay for you to do, but you need to waive your rights in order that you don't cause one to stumble. For example, look at what I've done. And he talks about his not receiving any support from them. He continues with the need for constant self-discipline in verses 24 through verse 27. He talks about how he'd become all things to all men, that by all means he might save some. And he says, they that run in a race run all, but one receives the prize. Even so run that you may obtain. Every man that strives in the games exercises self-control. I think that's the key to those passages. Self-control. Think about what you're doing. And you may have a right to do something. You may have a right to eat certain things, drink some things, but if you're in training, you don't. You exercise self-control. If you're a diabetic, you stay away from these sweets. You try to do you have to? No. But you exercise self-control. That's what he's saying. You exercise self-control in these rights that you may have, and don't exercise your liberty that would end up causing another to stumble. Then in chapter 10, he goes on to say that their ancestors, Israelite ancestors, provided a warning or an example, both really, to the Corinthians of what not to do. Well, you read the long list of some of the sins, a lot of it involved idolatry, fornication, all kinds of sensual problems, making trial of the Lord. All of those specifics that he mentioned had a direct bearing on what was going on there in Corinth. It was not just a listing of sins. These were matters that were pertaining to the Corinthians. And look at what they did. They thought they could flirt with all of these idolatrous practices and it not bother them. And guess what? It did. It did. So these things happened to them by way of example, upon whom the ends of the world are come, Paul says. And yet, he says, there's not any temptation taken you but such as common to man. But God is faithful, who will with these make also the way of escape. Well, what's the way of escape? Don't do it. Don't engage in these idolatrous practices. Don't engage in things that are sacrificed to idols that can cause a person to sin. Don't do all of that. So, Paul shows the absurdity, also in the 10th chapter, of performing two opposed practices. The eating of sacrifices to idols, that talks about the table of demons, likely in an idol's temple, and also eating the Lord's Supper, because you hear the table of the Lord. And he uses the word communion here several times. The bread which we break, is it not a communion of the body of Christ? The cup of blessings which we bless, is it not a communion with the blood of Christ? A sharing. Well, what's the idea? All right? It's a beautiful picture to help us even with the Lord's Supper. Let's think about the idol again. Here's a fellow in the idol's temple, and he's thinking about, oh, Bacchus, he's such a wonderful God. He's given us all this good, these grapevines, and we can get drunk and all that. And, oh, I'm just so thankful for Bacchus, and I'm going to eat this meat, and I'm going to be thinking about Bacchus all the time. On the other hand, here's the Lord. Here's the unleavened bread and the cup. He says we have communion. When we eat the bread, then we're thinking about Christ and the body and his life and what he taught and how he gave it for me. And when I drink the cup, I'm thinking about the blood that ratified the new covenant. And I'm a part of this covenant, and I need to keep this. All are all things. And when I'm thinking, it's almost like I'm viewing the Lord. And when I eat the bread and drink the cup, I have communion with the Lord. That's how, it's not any kind of mystical thing, but I'm sharing these ideas and appreciating, showing the Lord through my eating. I'm proclaiming the Lord's death till he come, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11. And so I'm showing the Lord my appreciation. Just like with the idols over here, I'm showing Bacchus my appreciation when I eat this thing sacrificed. He says, don't do that. You can't do both. You can't do both. It's an absurdity to try to think that you can. And so then at the end, he returns to the subject in chapter 8, and he concludes by permitting to eat meat sold in the marketplace if nothing were known about it. Notice in verse 25, whatsoever is sold in the shambles or the meat market, eat, asking no question for conscience sake. For because the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. These cows belong to the Lord. If one of them that believe not bids you to a feast, that is, why don't you come over for a meal tonight, and you're disposed to go, whatever is set before you, eat, asking no questions for conscience sake. That takes one of the questions that we asked earlier. Is it okay to eat meat in an unbeliever's house? And the answer is yes. But if any say this has been offered in sacrifice, don't eat, for his sake that showed it, not for yourself, but for conscience sake, not your own, but the others. For why is my liberty judged by another's conscience? And then he concludes. Notice down in verse 31, whether therefore you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. That is, everything I do, I need to say, is this a neutral practice? It's not going to hurt anybody. What about going on vacation? What's neutral? What about going to a particular place and eating? That's neutral if nothing wrong is going on there. Those things are okay. I can give glory to God, he says. But in verse 32, give no occasion of stumbling either to Jews or to Greeks, that be unbelievers among the Jews, unbelievers among the Greeks, or to the church of God, that be Christians. That includes everybody, those who are not Christians among Jews and Greeks, and those who are Christians. Whatever you do, don't give occasion to stumbling, even as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of the many. So be imitators of me, even as I also am of Christ. So the overall principles, I think, can be seen here, that in 31 through 33, never do anything questionable yourself. Don't ever do that. And do nothing that might cause another to stumble or sin. And from a positive point of view, seek what is good for everyone else. I think, now does that not parallel everything Jesus? Certainly it does. These are specific applications. Now, bear with me just a moment for some overall applications from this. Having a right to do something does not mean we are free to do it in all circumstances. Just because, who said this is a sin? Well, does what I am doing have a deleterious effect on this person over here? Think. I think sometimes people don't think. They don't think ahead. How is this going to affect? How does this person make me think? My father-in-law, Mr. Ratliff, made a point. We were talking about this not long ago. And I asked him, I thought, what do you think would be a modern-day example? He said, and he worked as an elder at Hansel for a number of years. And he said, fishing on Sundays. It's more of an all-day event, oftentimes. Well, you might go there at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. You might have been at services that day. But a lot of people see you there. I thought he was a Christian. Evidently, he doesn't think much about going to services. They may not have known that you went earlier. But you start thinking, does my action right at this place, at this time, affect someone's thinking in a wrong way? That they think, maybe I don't believe it's necessary to attend all the services. What about colored water and whiskey bottles? I don't hear about that much, but I used to when I was young. Here's a person, a Christian, and he somehow comes into contact with an old whiskey bottle, and there's nothing in it. And he puts colored water, and he puts it up maybe on a shelf somewhere, and it's not whiskey, but it looks like it could be. And he just kind of likes, or she likes, what it looks like. That used to be kind of a turn. When I was growing up, people would ask about that. What about colored water in whiskey bottles? Well, is that going to lead somebody in the right way? Is that going to lead someone to think, he would never drink for sure? I know better, though I see this whiskey bottle in his house and it looks like it's got whiskey. I know no, you don't want to do anything, say anything, or present yourself in such a way that it would lead a person to think like that. Playing cards. I know a lot of people can play gin rummy and go fishing and a lot of things. Everything is fine. When I was in school, away from home, that's not how people use cards. And it was gambling. It was gambling all the time. And I know I've had family members that play, and I've played a little with some cards, and it always kind of bothered me a little. Is there anything wrong with cards? No, I don't know of anything wrong with them. But what if you had a fellow who's been addicted to gambling and you use cards for 20 years? Think about that. It might be okay in certain circles, family circles, but think about others who might come in and some difficulties they might have. Buying a Coke in a bar, what about that? Somebody sees, well, I just need kind of a picker-upper. I need a pick-me-up. I need some caffeine. I'm going to go get me a Coke, or maybe a Mountain Dew. And I don't see a 7-Eleven. So there's a little bar over here. I know they have them. So what does that lead everybody who sees you go in to think? Usually you don't go in a bar to buy a Coke. You buy something else, like liquor of some kind. And the purpose of establishments becomes an issue. A second overall application, I believe, is that our liberties or freedoms should be limited in order to keep a weaker brother from sinning. That's kind of the major thing we've been talking about. They don't think, well, I need to do what I want to do. No, they can be limited. I remember talking to an older brother who's dead now, and he was in the home of a fella who tried to learn, study the Scripture, and he was convinced that since the New Testament used the term the breaking of bread, even in reference to common meals, in Acts 27 and the latter part of Acts 2, that even at a table, bread was never to be sliced with a knife. It was always to be broken by hand. And he thought, well, before he said anything, he said, that's kind of silly. Everybody knows better than that. But he said, I caught myself. I said, he's learning, and I don't want to make fun of him. I don't want to do anything that would cause him to violate his conscience. And so he was fine with that. Well, I think that's the attitude all of us ought to have. It may seem silly, but we're not going to poke fun. In fact, that's the idea of setting it naught or despising someone that Paul talked about in Romans 14. Another idea, an overall application, I believe, is avoid anything that makes a Christian think less of his faith or causes an unsaved person to feel at ease in his sin. Anything that makes a Christian think less of his faith, that it's okay if I flirt over here with this, or I do, that as long. I've heard young people say, we'll go on maybe a vacation together. They're not married, and they stay in the same motel room. They got twin bed. Well, I'm going to go to the bathroom first and fully clothed, and then, I don't believe that. I don't believe that's right. That you've got all the kinds of temptations. You don't want to put yourself in a position of tempting another or tempting yourself to do what you know would be wrong. Avoid anything that makes a Christian think less of his faith or it causes an unsaved person to feel at ease in sin. Don't say, don't do, or go anywhere that may lead yourself or someone else to do wrong. Don't say something that might spawn another to fight back. Don't do that. Don't do something yourself that you know. There was a couple that Lee and I knew, lived in another state, and a fellow said, I know the hot buttons to push to make my wife just aggravated with me. Well, why do that? Why push those buttons? If you know what they are, don't do things that you know will annoy someone and cause them to do wrong, or someone else, or that would lead yourself to do wrong. Paul was not discussing in this chapter collective matters, something that involves everyone at one time. Sometimes brethren have mentioned, well, this bothers my conscience, and that means the whole church is involved. It depends on the issue, but that's not really what Paul is talking about in this chapter, or these chapters. It's basically causing not something that I don't like, but actually causing me to go beyond and violate my conscience and sin. And I think that's it. Well, I want to end with this idea, and that is that our influence, your influence and mine, matter. They matter greatly. God will judge us as to what we do with our influence. So we need to be careful. We need to think ahead. Think how we speak, what we say. Think how we present ourselves to others, what we do, and where we go. Think all the time about those matters. It becomes second nature to us after a while. And we're thinking ahead, well, what can I say to help this fellow to come closer to God? Or what can I say to encourage him to think more seriously about the Bible? Or what can I, and then we start thinking about that, and I'll tell you another thing that I think helps. Brief prayers. Brief prayer. Before you go to work, before you know you're on your car, you're in your car to go see somebody, a brief prayer. Father, help me to say and to be and to do what Jesus would do in this situation. And that can help us. It focuses our attention that I want to try to help this person go to heaven, not harm him. Win him to Christ, not repel him from Christ. And I think that is really, in a nutshell, what all these passages are teaching. You've listened patiently, and I appreciate it, and I hope our lesson has been helpful. And honestly, it's helpful to me to try to prepare for this, to just think about all these matters that involve our salvation. If you're not a Christian, we hope you'll become one tonight. I believe most of us are. And if something is amiss in life and publicly needs to be made right through repentance and confession, prayer about that, we stand ready to help you in any way we can. Come to the front as together we stand in